One comes from someone who spent years at Goldman Sachs, 13 years on Wall Street to be exact. This seasoned financier recently published an op-ed. His name is Haar, and he asked, why does legacy finance continue to dismiss Bitcoin? Surprisingly, the answer lies in a fundamental ignorance, a lack of understanding of money and its history. This news resonated with me because he himself comes from the legacy world. He is part of that system, and now he's the one starting to ask the hard questions, the very same questions I've been asking. In fact, over the past year, among the conversations I've had with you, this was one of the most fundamental questions. Why do economists refuse to embrace Bitcoin? Why does the mainstream establishment struggle to accept Bitcoin at all? And because he comes from that world, he articulates it far more clearly than I ever could. I had only suspicions, but this man from Wall Street, a self-proclaimed financial expert who uses math tools, builds algorithms, and writes code, even they don't understand what money actually is. It's ignorance, pure and simple. I saw it that way too. But when I say things like this, as some of you may have seen last year, PhDs in economics would scoff. He can't even publish in a top-tier journal. Who is he to talk? That's the kind of ad hominem attack they launch. They attack the messenger, not the message. But now to these critics, what will they say? A man who spent 13 years on Wall Street is now saying failing to understand Bitcoin is simply a matter of ignorance, specifically ignorance about the history and essence of money itself. They don't know what money is. You see, while economics as a tool is logical, rigorous, and precise, there are domains where humanities matter, areas that require philosophical or qualitative insight, but they tend to disregard that. Yes, that's a common pattern. They often dismiss deductive reasoning, don't they? Which means they haven't really thought deeply about money in its most fundamental form. That's why Bitcoin seems to them like a platypus, unfamiliar and unnatural. There's another article. Look it up yourselves. I'll leave the link in the description. It was published in Bitcoin magazine, and its title is quite provocative. Why wasn't Bitcoin invented at a university? Exactly that. And it's a fascinating read. What really caught my attention was that finally academia is starting to engage with this. And what do they say? They say Bitcoin actually has a lineage, yes, a legitimate academic genealogy. Among all cryptocurrencies out there, Bitcoin remains the most academically studied and scrutinized because when it comes to blockchain in general, it often lacks any academic background. Most of it is invented ad hoc by developers, man. Designed in industry, built on the fly, but Bitcoin is in fact a product of academia. It evolved gradually over 2 decades from countless small innovations. As many of you already know, technologies like blockchain and cryptography, which are used in Bitcoin, weren't invented by Satoshi Nakamoto. They already existed. What Satoshi did was to take concepts from microeconomics and game theory and apply them with precision at just the right moment to spark a kind of intellectual eureka, all those principles woven together into one system. That's what Satoshi Nakamoto accomplished. So then the question becomes, if its roots are academic, why couldn't Bitcoin have been invented at a university? And that's where the article reaches its conclusion. It's absolutely fascinating. But the reason I'm sharing this article with you, the real reason, is that it supports what I've been arguing all along. After all, even the title of my book is The Genealogy of Wisdom. The idea that Bitcoin has an intellectual lineage is something academia, just like that earlier article from a Wall Street veteran, is finally beginning to recognize. The reason Wall Street was so blind to Bitcoin was simply because it never truly understood money. It's not really about Bitcoin itself. That's what he's pointing out, something I've said many times before. But now someone from that world is saying it, which I find encouraging. And I think you'll also feel, yes, that actually makes sense now. When I say it, I'm just some nobody, right? But this next article, this one's from academia. It argues that Bitcoin has intellectual ancestry. Then why wasn't it invented within a university? Why did it emerge organically in industry instead of through academic institutions? The article lays out several reasons. First, Bitcoin was radically disruptive. It was a giant leap forward, a leapfrog moment, a truly massive leap. Now, I'm no academic insider, but in academia, only incremental ideas are typically accepted for publication. So something as revolutionary as Bitcoin, if it had been submitted for peer review, it likely wouldn't have passed. Sounds a bit ironic, doesn't it? It leaped too far ahead. Another reason is this. It's too interdisciplinary. The article mentions examples like mathematics, computer science, and economics. Even this author, though, I don't think he's gone quite far enough yet. Bitcoin is also a geopolitical asset, so geopolitics plays a crucial role here too. The concept of geopolitics is incredibly important, even if you don't use that exact term. Think back to the age of exploration, that ties into this article too. Back then, during the oceanic era, global currencies first emerged. They started to gain significance. But we've barely studied that era's monetary implications. To understand the age of exploration, you must understand how great powers engage in geopolitical struggles for dominance. But geopolitics is often left out of the analysis. Even this author, he's no exception, but I believe he'll come to that realization soon. Here's what I mean. If you're someone who's studying money now, or you're part of the academic world, if that describes you, I highly recommend reading these 2 articles. I too came to this realization through Bitcoin. I learned it in reverse, so to speak. As I studied, I realized the concept of money I had learned in economics was actually very narrow. It only applied to a limited, specific context in human history. In other words, it was based on the assumption that there are no unknown frontiers. A system built on total predictability, especially in the post-1945 global order, where nations, excluding the former communist bloc, largely operate within a coordinated international framework. It all rests on a shared promise, a mutual trust in the monetary system. That underlying assumption shapes far more than we realize. But the age of exploration was all about confronting the unknown, and when you encounter uncharted worlds, you need a different kind of money. In the familiar mapped world, where trust has been established, the system functions smoothly, bills of exchange work, checks circulate, and banking networks operate as expected. But when you face a completely unknown counterpart, possibly an enemy, or maybe not, and you need some resource they have, that's when trade becomes complex, and you still have to engage in exchange. But not by simple barter. What you need is a truly universal, not just global, a system of promises that everyone can recognize. You need a trust system. And in that context, the most essential function of money is not hedging against inflation, nor merely serving as a means of exchange, nor even functioning as a unit of account. In fact, the most important reason humans invented money, its primary purpose, something they never teach you in school, is precisely this: to enable cooperation with people you do not trust. Even in wartime, economic cooperation continues. Now, I know that word cooperation might sound strange or even off-putting in this context. Even with enemies in wartime, humans continuously exchange signals. You could call it negotiation, which sounds more neutral, but negotiation can also be misleading. Even during war between enemies, we never stop signaling. That's human nature. It's a form of communication. To put it simply, likewise money. And when dealing with the unknown, there's no inherent trust. Yet with such unpredictable parties, some form of cooperation is still necessary. Communication, exchange. That's where money plays its role. Yes, money becomes crucial in that context, but we tend to exclude that dimension. We ignore it, focusing only on the known world where systems and trust are already in place. It's a world with established order. That's the basis for most monetary theories. Inflation hedge, medium of exchange, unit of account. Those are the typical narratives. But as we study Bitcoin, we can attempt to understand where it's headed. And there's a more important question we must ask. Why do I keep calling Bitcoin a geopolitical asset? This is exactly why. As global order begins to unravel, we are once again encountering unknown counterparts. It's starting to resemble a new age of exploration. That, in fact, is our true condition. We were just living in an unusual state of order temporarily for over 70 years, and even that unusual order, some people embraced it, others rejected it, some were desperate to abolish it, but it persisted regardless. Now that era is coming to a close. Time will soon tell whether that was a good era or a deeply flawed one. Ultimately, every worldview, every ideology will be put to the test, and in any case, a tool that allows cooperation with the unknown. That tool is money, plain and simple. Even the Crusaders and the Muslims engaged in trade with one another. The Crusaders didn't just loot everything. The region now known as Israel was called Lepanto at the time. When they reached Lepanto, they had to deal with Muslim merchants to mobilize resources. Those merchants were technically the enemy, not soldiers, but on the opposing side. And yet, even with the enemy, you still need a medium for exchange. Modern monetary policy doesn't account for that. And that kind of money is of a different nature. That's why it was gold. Gold was the universal medium of exchange. Why has gold been such an exceptional form of money? Because of that exact quality. It allowed trade with even one's enemies, but we rarely study this aspect of money. So one issue is lack of interdisciplinary perspective. Bitcoin is too interdisciplinary and too much of a leap forward. But there's another reason. Bitcoin was born out of a libertarian mindset. It's in fact an extremely libertarian one. You could trace it back to contributors of the Extropy magazine, a small intellectual community. The circle that ultimately conceived Bitcoin was that small society. Extropy, however, published everything under the sun. I think it started back in the 1990s. They talked about aliens too. There were no boundaries. Their imagination knew no limits. And from that, a powerful idea emerged that we need money beyond the reach and knowledge of governments. That line of thinking had been developing for 20 to 30 years, philosophically driven, though it had a separate technical lineage too. Bitcoin emerged from that ecosystem, which was far from mainstream. Liberalism might be mainstream, libertarianism is not. It's completely marginal, a minority within a minority, and extremely radical libertarians at that. So when it came to academia, there was no intellectual soil for Bitcoin to grow. Universities had completely purged libertarian thought. That's why libertarians couldn't even lecture in universities anymore. Sure, writing papers is what academics do, but first they need to be able to teach. That's how they secure their livelihood. Only then can they pursue research, but libertarians were pushed out of academia entirely. So back to the question, why didn't Bitcoin emerge from a university setting? And why has Wall Street failed to understand Bitcoin? These may seem like two separate questions, but in reality, they're one and the same. Why? Because they share a blind spot. Neither understands the age of exploration. Today's academics and professionals have little to no background in that pivotal era of global history, and what they do know is often distorted. And they think it was just about wrecking unknown lands within 20 or 30 years, destroying cultures, conquering everything. That's the only story they've been taught. Even educated people have no idea about the 500-year arc of history that followed, and because they lack that foundation, people without that perspective operate within neatly constructed, internally consistent monetary systems, focused on things like macroeconomic issues, how to reduce unemployment, how to stimulate the economy. They're trained only in monetary policy for these purposes, but the idea that money is a tool for communicating with the unknown, possibly the most important concept, is completely absent. So their entire framework is limited. That's why Wall Street didn't see Bitcoin, and academia couldn't invent it. That wraps up the video. Thank you for watching.